Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for this showing of this brand new film, Ithaka. And then after that, we'll have a panel discussion with John Shipton, who's the father of Julian Assange, Gabriel Shipton, who's Julian's half-brother and also one of the producers of the film, and also John Nichols, local journalist here in Madison, Wisconsin, who writes for the Capital Times and, of course, my magazine, The Progressive. A couple of quick thank yous. I want to thank the Barrymore Theater for opening their doors to this event, as they do to so many other just amazing community events here in Madison. Especially thanks to Steve and Lucy and Zach and Brian, who keep the place running here. I also want to thank another Brian Alberth of Left Effect Media, who's going to be recording the panel tonight for us, and he's done a lot of video programs for the Progressive magazine, which you can see on our website, on our YouTube site, YouTube/The Progressive. I also want to mention the folks from the Free Julian Assange Defense Committee are out in the lobby with a literature table, and they're collecting signatures on petitions. And they said, make sure when you sign on the petition to also check the little box next to it. So they have some literature out there for free about Julian Assange and the case. And also at the Progressive magazine table, we have some books, including a brand new book that's just come out by a Chicago-based journalist, Kevin Gostola, that's very good, and I encourage you to check it out. So this story is of particular interest to me. I am the publisher of the Progressive magazine, based here in Madison, Wisconsin, and Julian Assange is being prosecuted as a publisher of information. The Progressive magazine has our own story. In 1979, we fought a 6-month battle with the US government that was trying to prevent us from publishing an article that contained information that they said was not only secret, but they referred to it as born secret. And we fought that battle, and eventually the government actually vacated the case. They pulled out of the case because they realized they were going to lose in court, and they didn't want a law getting written that said that people could publish secret information. So the government pulled out of the case. We went ahead and published the article. It came out in November of 1979. So this story of the prosecution, I should say persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange comes out very clearly in this film, and I think that you'll really see his humanity depicted in this film as well, and that's, I think, part of what the filmmakers were trying to do. We'll have a chance to hear more about that at the end, but I'm going to leave the stage here and let you enjoy the movie. Thank you so much. The music that we're listening to in the background, by the way, is from a song that was written by Pacifica Radio journalist Dennis Bernstein, who took his reporter's notebooks and turned them into lyrics and partnered together with musician Francisco Herrera to write this song, Free Julian Now, which they're producing a video of that's going to be available soon as well. Well, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our speakers tonight. Again, all the way to my right, John Shipton, father of Julian Assange, and you've just watched him in all sorts of settings throughout the film. Gabriel Shipton, who is John's son, Julian's half-brother, and one of the producers of this amazing film, which has won numerous awards. And also John Nichols, local journalist here in Madison, national journalist for the Progressive Magazine and The Nation, and author of many books. John had a column today in the Capital Times, which I'll just quote briefly here. The concern is that by prosecuting Assange under the draconian law that was written in 1917 to prohibit interference with military operations or recruitment during World War I, the Justice Department could create a new tool for intimidating investigative reporters who simply seek to inform the American people about what is being done in their name, but without their informed consent. John Nichols, let me hand it off to you to start with for a few comments, and then we'll go on to Gabriel and John.
Well, thanks, Norman. And here I'm going to stand up because I think it's easier to see people, especially as we're completing the fundraising process here. And thanks to the Progressive Magazine for putting this event together tonight. Progressive, located in Madison. And the Progressive's connection is relevant to what's being discussed tonight, because the Progressive was founded by Robert M. La Follette, the great Wisconsin governor and U.S. senator. And in 1917, when the Espionage Act was enacted, Robert M. La Follette was one of the handful of U.S. senators who opposed this country's entry into World War I. And what he warned about at that time was that the war would be used as an excuse to assault civil liberties and civil rights in the United States. He was exactly correct about that. He warned in a speech called Free Speech in Wartime that freedom of the press would be threatened by not just the entry into the war and all the energies that went around it, but also by the enactment of legislation designed specifically to shut down a free and open discourse in the United States about what was being done in the name of the American people without their informed consent. This is what La Follette warned about in 1917. It's what has informed the Progressive Magazine since then. And there's a Wisconsin connection to the story of Julian Assange, because one of the first people to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act was Victor Berger, the publisher of the Milwaukee Leader. The Milwaukee Leader was effectively banned from distribution in the mails. Victor Berger was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in jail for publishing anti-war statements under the Espionage Act. Now, Berger fought that case and ultimately won in the U.S. Supreme Court. But that case, his conviction in 1919, was used as an excuse to bar him from taking his seat in the United States Congress when he was elected in the 1918 election by the people of Milwaukee to represent them in Congress. The other members of Congress refused to let him take his seat, very relevant to our current discussions as regards Tennessee and the expulsion or barring of members of Congress. And so the Espionage Act has been used for more than 100 years to shut down journalism and to shut down honest discourse about matters of war and peace. And it's one of the reasons that I feel a personal responsibility to speak out on these issues. As a working journalist, I think it is vital that the people who use and take advantage of freedom of the press in the United States also defend it. And that defense of freedom of the press has to bring us around to the case of Julian Assange. Julian Assange is not an American, but he did the work of exposing what the U.S. government was doing, what the U.S. military was doing, and he did so in the way that journalists do. He got a leak, and he worked with that information and published it. Now, you can like Julian Assange, you can dislike him, you can like his dad and his brother or dislike him, but what you cannot deny is that if Julian Assange is returned to the United States and prosecuted under the Espionage Act for the supposed crime of gathering information, reporting that information, publishing that information, then you have opened up a new avenue by which the United States government can, even more aggressively than it has in the past, seek to shut down discourse about matters of war and peace. It doesn't have to stop at matters of war and peace. It could be extended beyond that. But the bottom line is, this is something that cannot stand. And it's very vital to understand that slowly, U.S. journalists have begun to speak up on this issue. Last year, you saw a number, and that's what this article Norm was referencing. Last year, you saw a number of U.S. journalists, prominent publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and others, speak out about this issue and finally clearly say that prosecution of Julian Assange would be a threat to journalism. So we're seeing a beginning of a real discourse about this. But I have to emphasize, it's not as bold as it should be. I, for many years, have been involved with the International Federation of Journalists, which is the coalition of unions that represent journalists around the world. I've keynoted their international conferences twice and worked with them on a number of issues. And the IFJ, the International Federation of Journalists, has been way out front on these fundamental issues because they recognize that if you criminalize what Julian Assange did, you will ultimately end up criminalizing journalism, not just in the United States, but in countries around the world. So this is a vital issue for journalists. It is a vital issue for freedom of the press. And frankly, it's a vital issue for democracy. Because the fact of the matter is, as Robert M. La Follette warned back in 1917, if you do not have a free press in a time of war, if you do not have an honest discourse at a point when a country might be entering into war or might already be engaged in war, if you cannot expose what is being done to either draw that country into the war or to maintain that country's presence in the war, then you have lost the ability in a democracy to have the most vital of all debates, and that is whether your country will commit itself to military action abroad that might well involve not just the deaths of people from your country, but the deaths of people from other countries. That's a fundamental debate that every country should always have before a war and even during a war. And yet, if you use the Espionage Act and other tools to shut down a free and open discourse, you threaten that essential small d democratic principle. And so, in the name of Robert M. La Follette and the great progressive tradition in Wisconsin, I will simply say the United States government should drop the charges against Julian Assange and end this persecution, not just of a man, but of the practice of journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And there is some fairly exciting news on this front happening at the political level, which is Congressmember Rashida Tlaib has circulated a letter. It's a Dear Colleague letter to her colleagues in the U.S. Congress, asking them to sign on to a letter that will be sent to Attorney General Merrick Garland, asking him to drop the charges. And just a little quick quote from that letter to her colleagues. She says, "Defendants charged under the Espionage Act are effectively incapable of defending themselves and are often not allowed to access to all the evidence being brought against them or even to testify to the motivation behind their actions. Mr. Assange's prosecution marks the first time in U.S. history the Espionage Act has been used to indict a publisher of truthful information. The prosecution of Mr. Assange, if successful, not only sets a legal precedent whereby journalists or publishers can be prosecuted, but a political one as well. In the future, the New York Times or Washington Post could be prosecuted when they publish important stories based on classified information. Or just as dangerous, they may refrain from publishing such stories for fear of prosecution." So that letter is going out to all of the members of Congress, trying to get them to sign on. I know that I was in Milwaukee for the screening of the film a couple days ago, and the local group there is organizing to get Gwen Moore to agree to sign on the letter. And here in Madison, Wisconsin, of course, Mark Pocan is our representative. I've been in touch with his staff today about this, and I urge people to contact their elected representatives on this issue. Gabriel and John, you have traveled a long way, and as we saw in the film, many years now in this project. Gabriel, maybe you could start and talk a little bit about how this film came to be, your work on it, and where it's gone so far and where you hope for it to go.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, John, for your comments as well. So I guess it was back in 2019, when Julian was taken from the Ecuadorian embassy, where he spent 7.5 years, and he was taken and put in this maximum security prison, Belmarsh, that you saw in the film, and that's at that time is when those Espionage Act charges were revealed that John was talking about. And when he first went to the prison, he was being kept in solitary confinement in a section of the prison that the prisoners call the Hell Wing, which is actually the health wing of the prison. It's where they keep the most terminally ill, suicidal prisoners, as Stella says in the film. And it was during that time that John and I went to see him with John Pilger. And I left the prison that day feeling, that I might not see Julian again. And I started to think of ways of how I can help, how I can get involved, what I could do to sort of change this situation, to tell people about the side of the story that I understood as Julian's family member, that John understood, and that Stella and all the people who were closest to Julian experienced his persecution and what he'd been going through for the last 10 years, because there was this disconnect with what was going on and being shown in the media to what we knew and how we experienced his persecution. So I'm a film producer. I usually produce scripted drama feature films with actors and props and sets, and so I really wanted to tell this or do a film from an emotional perspective, because I'd seen how that worked, with narrative features. They're very emotional films, and they really engage audiences on a different level than any work that had been done in the past about Julian Assange. So it would be a unique perspective in that sense. And that's when John, at the time, was travelling around Europe. He was advocating for Julian with politicians, supporters, the press, as you see in the film. And Nils, who's our DOP, Nils Ladefoged, was just started following John and followed John for the next 2 and a bit years, and also with Stella. And we amassed this archive of footage over 230 days of this intimate behind-the-scenes footage that you see in the film. And we eventually brought on a director, Benjamin Lawrence, who I hadn't met before this project. And so it was really good to get his perspective on the whole story as well. And Ben did those incredible interviews that you see that string the whole film together with John. That's over 13 hours of interview in that tiny kitchen, over the period of the court case that you see. So that's really how this, film came to be. It's not easy making a political film, particularly one that is counter-narrative. But I think what kept driving us forward was the urgency around this, that this needed to be done, that this story needed to be told. And Julian's dire situation really drove me to get this project over the line. We did hit a lot of resistance along the way. I don't know, any of you who have ever worked in the film business, there's gatekeepers at every level, every funding body, every broadcaster. They all want to, put their spin on things. But we found a way through, and through John's story and through Stella's story, we were able to break through those barriers and bring you this film today.
Thank you so much. And I first met these two about a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. And it's great to have them back in Madison again. John, your story in the film, I mean, you say it more than once, that really it's about, as a father, protecting and helping as best you can your son in this dire situation. And you use a stronger word than that in the film. But you've also been an incredibly articulate spokesperson about the free speech issues behind this whole case and what it means for democracies. And I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit, and about the power of this case, both the case against Julian Assange and the case for his liberation.
Thanks, Norm. Thank you, John, and thank you, Gabrielle. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. To address this subject, we could start with using Julian as an iconic example. The most vicious hatred, the most vicious malice, the most unscrupulous scandal and vituperation followed Julian after he revealed. As a consequence of that, the destruction of his aura, if you like, and the attempted destruction of his physical being, we see the collapse in a 3D, 13.5-year unfolding, the collapse of the vital, wonderful institutions that constitute what we call the United States. In particular, 1 to 10 of the Bill of Rights, and numero uno, the First Amendment. It no longer exists as a protection. Founded upon the Bill of Rights in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt and Herbert Bear Everett brought about in the United Nations the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was adopted by the United Nations, and a little later folded into the Council of Europe, and every legislative body in Europe embraces the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The First Amendment, the Council of Europe has Clause 10, where they enfolded into their national legislation a variation on the First Amendment. Their First Amendment, their Clause 10 goes to say, you've got free speech, free publication, except in certain circumstances. If I may, as an Australian, remind you that the First Amendment is categorical. It's not modified. It's not anything other than the government will make no laws. Free speech, religion, and assembly. Categorical. Anything that the government uses to abrogate, to abridge that, is an attack upon the United States itself, because it is a republic of laws existing under the Constitution. Without the Constitution, as Robert Kennedy tweeted the other day, without a free press, there's a no America. Without Julian Assange's freedom, there's no free press. Unpack the first sentence for ourselves together here tonight. Pull it apart a little bit. If you take away the free press, it's no longer the United States of America. It emerges as some other thing. What they are attempting to make it become is up to the citizens and communities and states of the United States to illuminate for themselves and move against, in my view. Some might like it. I think it's horrifying, actually. Because the beauty of the United States in 1790 was the adoption of an understanding in the First Amendment that there's a symbiotic relationship with a republic and the publication of knowledge and the inculcation of that knowledge into the body politic as a growth of knowledge and understanding, and as a consequence of that, a constant improvement and adjustment as time unfolds before our eyes, because not always things remain the same. So in order to do that, you have the First Amendment, which fulfills in each epoch the demands to renew the society so that it can continue to flourish. It's so simple and elegant and beautiful, and it's parlayed around the world in every Western country. In my country, every election, every 3 years, certain candidates put up their hand and say, well, we're going to have a Bill of Rights, or we're going to have a First Amendment of our very own. Of course, it never happens. Once they get into government, the events take over and governing takes over. The glory of these things that came into being after the Second World War, a worldwide catastrophe. And the people of the world, not the leaders, by the way, the people of the world rebuilt the world with phenomenal energies and intellectual energies, which created the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted the Geneva Conventions into the United Nations, and finally the Conventions of Asylum. 1958, they came into being. In 1973, under the guidance of Australia, I'll put my hand up for this one, under the guidance of Australia, they were adopted into the United Nations, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. Every single one of them has been abridged to pursue Julian Assange, to blight and chill at a distance, in a roundabout way, the capacity of people within the United States to report upon their government. Equally, it extends in an absurd ambition which cannot be fulfilled and will only bring obloquy to the people of the United States, of the United States Department of Justice and Department of State to reach in to another country, for another country's citizen, and perform a judicial kidnap, threatening 175 years jail. And if that fails, it's sufficient to the day for their aims to have that person banged up now for 14 years. This week, actually, the 11th, tomorrow. 14 years. We contemplate this crime with shame in my country, with disgrace. You know, Sweden, we used to see Sweden as a model society, a mixed market with socialisation of this, that and the other, and capitalisation of this, that and the other. And a fair mix it was. Now, after the Assange saga, we just know Sweden with poor law administration and making junk furniture, which they distribute around the world. The United Kingdom, it has a reputation as being the mother of parliaments, the maker of laws, and having the at Rumimi, the name's gone out of my head. Sorry. The Magna Carta placing a shield of protection between the people and the sovereign or the state. It protects us from the state, because the state often gets excessive and nervous and insecure. We can't see why, but they do. It's just a phenomenon of being human. Where is it now? Who would write a contract in London? I think they write for about $2 trillion a year. Who would write a contract in London that may go into dispute to expect fair adjudication after watching the Assange saga where judge after judge... Well, anyway, I'll wrap up now, but I was in Dublin and on the stage with Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, just like now. Claire Daly, she's such a speaker. I mean, she is fantastic. Anyway, I was wanting to criticise, because, you know, I gauged my audience, I was wanting to criticise the British judiciary, but I didn't want to criticise them too harshly, because I want them to free Julian, you know, to free my son. So I was looking around for a way to articulate that. An Irishman, you know, I started off with something, and an Irishman got up in the middle. He said, John, I can't mimic his accent, forgive me, John, in the shade of the moon, in the light of the sun, there's nothing you can tell us about the British judiciary.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, you know, the question before us is, what can one person do? And I think that John Shipton is an amazing example of what one person can do, traveling around the globe and building support for the case of his son, Julian, getting majorities in some countries, but certainly large quantities of members of parliaments all over Europe, getting presidents of many, not all, but almost all of the countries of South America that have stood up and said Julian Assange should be free. What can we do here in this audience? There's a petition out in the lobby that you can sign. You can contact your congresspeople and get them to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter that Rashida Tlaib is circulating around right now. You can talk to your elected representatives. You can talk to the people that we put in office to guard our interests. And, you know, there's only one thing right now that's standing in the way of the freedom of Julian Assange, and that's the United States not being willing to rescind its attempt at extradition. So it could be done very quickly, like that. And it's pressure of people like yourselves that can make that happen. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Please share this story. You can pick up these postcards in the lobby that will tell you where the other screenings of this film are going to be. It's going to be also on television in Australia, right? Coming up?
On the public broadcaster in Australia, so it's been on the ABC there. It will be on the television in the UK, but I can't say more about that yet.
Okay. Final comments, Gabriel, John. You've come a long way. Tell us what your next plans are and what your hopes are for this project.
Well, we'll continue on this tour with Ithaka around the country until the until the 19th of April. So yeah, grab one of those cards or go to ithaka.movie to find out where we are next, and yet encourage people to go along and come and see us. Also, if you want to host a screening of the film, you can do that on the website. You just put your details into the form there, and you can host your own screening, invite people, speakers, etc. So that's The next stage of Ithaka in the United States is the community screenings and the hosted screenings. So, and thanks for coming. Thanks, obviously, to Norman, the Progressive. Thanks.
And thank you also to the Barrymore Theatre for opening their doors. Thanks to WRT Community Radio. Thank you to John Nichols and the Capital Times. And thanks to all of you as well.
Thank you very much, everybody.
As a journalist, I saw that we could achieve a lot of reform with a little bit of work. In some cases, one classified video can possibly stop a war.
A military chopper opens fire, instruments of genocide. WikiLeaks unmask the lies of orders queued by Central Command. Gunsight video nails the murder scene down. Julian told the truth about the war machine. It's getting late in the hour. Don't wait another minute to speak truth to power. Victims of smart bombs went up in flames, Baghdad on fire. Julian Assange